Billions of dollars are on the line when Canadians go to the polls on Monday. That's because between tax cuts and healthcare enhancements, as well as breaks for homeowners, the candidates are all making some big and potentially costly promises. So this week, we're asking parties how they'll pay for all those promises. We've heard from the Greens, the Liberals, and the Conservatives, rounding out our series, the NDP. Peter Julian is a BC NDP candidate. He joins us now from Vancouver. Hi, Mr. Julian. Great to see you. Thanks for making time for us.
Good to be with you.
So your party outlines in its platform various ways that you'll be able to pay for the promises you make, including a substantial increase in the federal portion of the corporate tax rate from 15 to 18%. Former parliamentary budget watchdog Kevin Page points out that there is no discussion, and I'm quoting here, of the challenges related to competitiveness and productivity or the potential negative economic impacts associated with large corporate tax increases over the short term. He outlines that none of that is included in the platform. Why didn't your party take that into account?
Well, indeed we do, because when you look at our platform, certainly raising the rates back to where they were in 2010, but providing the investments that are actually going to make a difference in people's lives, affordable housing, taking off the excessive profit that the federal government has put into student debt, making sure that childcare is available, making sure that we're making these investments for dental care. All of those things actually help the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. I live in an area where there's a housing crisis, and business people tell me that they can't get folks who, employees, to come work for them, often because there's no affordable housing available. We're seeing a shortage of key skills because students are going in and coming out of post-secondary education with a $50,000 or $60,000 debt. And the business sector pays about $6 billion a year in drug plans that with a universal Pharmacare plan, they would not have to pay anymore. And in the same way that our universal Medicare is a huge competitive advantage, every Canadian employee has a $3,000 advantage compared to an employee hired in an American company where they have to pay for a Medicare plan. All of these elements actually help to contribute to business competitiveness.
But you don't quantify, for example, by how much you think those methods or those promises will increase competitiveness or grow the GDP, grow the economy, right? Some economists are worried about raising that corporate tax rate and taking away competitiveness, for, decreasing the amount of competitiveness for businesses who want to build their business in this country. It's not like you quantify what you're saying.
You should come and speak, and those economists should come and speak to the business sector in my area of Canada, because these are major elements that are a real brake on business development and business growth. What we're saying is we need to invest in Canadians. That's why we are looking to build the affordable housing that hasn't been built over the last few decades, doing catch up because the housing crisis is something that it impacts many areas of the country, putting in place Pharmacare, putting in place effective dental care for lower income Canadians and Canadian families earning less than $100,000 a year. All of those things help Canadians, but they also have a positive impact on the business sector. And that's why we're looking for this balance. When these corporate taxes were cut, when the capital gains were cut, what we have ended up with is Canadian families struggling under record debt loads. Canadian families have paid the price. So we want to reinvest, and by reinvesting, not only do we help those families that have really fallen behind, but we also help the business sector because the business sector is quite aware of how Canadians are feeling and the struggles of the Canadian families are experiencing across the country.
I take your point on what it would add to the economy, and how individuals might have felt sort of left behind. But businesses as well are struggling with competitiveness, even under the current climate. The World Economic Forum on Wednesday said that Canada had dropped 2 spots in its global competitiveness ranking to 14th place, while Canada's stock of foreign direct investment has climbed on average over the last 5 years at about half the annual pace of FDI to the U.S. So instead of investment coming here, it's going to the U.S. How would an NDP-led government combat that?
Well, we would be looking at substantive public investments, and that's outlined in our platform. Investments in affordable housing, investments in childcare. All of that will bring up the overall level of investments.
But what if your increase to the corporate tax rate makes that worse?
No, the overall investment would increase because what we're doing is putting in place a fairer tax system. And because of that, the increased public investment, coupled with private investment, will see our overall investment across the country rise. It's a different approach than what we've seen from Conservatives and Liberals. They have cut the corporate tax rate, they've cut the capital gains, the percentage of capital gains benefits that are actually subject to income tax. They haven't put in place any sort of wealth tax. And what we've seen in Canada is Canadian families struggling under record levels of debt, 2 Canadian billionaires having as much wealth as a third of the Canadian population. We're seeing most Canadian families struggling in any one month to make ends meet, about $200 away from not being able to pay their bills. These are all things that have had a profound impact on Canada. So we take a different approach. What we would do is restore rates that were fair taxation rates from a few years ago, when Canada actually had a higher quality of life and a higher standard of living. And by doing that, we would increase the overall investment, both public and private, in this country. And that's to the benefit of all.
I take your point. I just make the point that the argument you're making isn't quantified precisely in the platform. But I also want to ask you about Pharmacare, because that is costed fully in your platform. You've allotted $10 to $11 billion a year, but the report commissioned by the federal government earlier this year pegged the cost at about $15 billion a year at its top end there. Do you expect the difference to be made up by provinces?
The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer, Novas, she produced a report that actually said with universal pharmacare, Canadians as a whole would save about $4 billion. So costs that we are paying currently would go from $24 billion to $20 billion a year. The provinces do take a portion of that, but what we are putting forward is the federal government paying preponderantly the majority of the costs around pharmacare. That certainly benefits individuals that are struggling to pay for their medication, and you know as well as I do, they're seniors often having to beg because the cost of their medication was simply too high. People having to make tough choices about whether to pay the rent, put food on the table, or pay for their medication. So there's a personal cost. But also, by putting in place universal pharmacare, we get the ability to negotiate better agreements with the pharmaceutical companies. And in New Zealand, where they put forward universal pharmacare, they actually saved up to 90% of the cost of certain medications by having that bulk purchasing power. So the provinces would be kicking in a portion far lower than what they're actually paying now. But overall, as a whole, Canadians would benefit. And as I mentioned, the $6 billion that Canadian businesses are currently paying in drug plans would be eliminated. Another incentive, another competitive advantage for Canadian businesses.
So, sorry, what is the specific portion, though, that an NDP-led government would expect the provinces to pay?
Well, we're looking at the difference between the annual cost that we've foreseen, which is about $11 billion a year, as you mentioned, and the overall cost of universal pharmacare, which is currently about $20 billion estimated by the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer. Provinces, as you know, pay about $12 billion of this. So this would be a marked reduction from what the provinces are currently paying, but this would be something that we would negotiate with the provinces, of course.
We've already heard from, for example, the province of Quebec, the government in that province, as well as the government leading this province right here in Ontario, that they don't want to be, at this point, a part of any kind of universal nationwide pharmacare program. What do you do about that? Are the assumptions that you've made in your platform predicated on an unrealistic situation?
Not at all, because Tommy Douglas, when he brought in, the first NDP leader, when he brought in universal Medicare in Saskatchewan, and then it was moved and extended across the country, there was a bit of a tug of war with some of the provinces as well, but everybody saw the interest of putting in place universal public health care in this country. It's the same with Pharmacare. I expect that there will be some tug of war with some of the provinces, but ultimately, I cannot see political leaders saying, well, no, gee, we don't, when people in the other parts of the country are covered by universal pharmacare, we want to have our seniors begging to pay for their medications at the end of the month. I think in the great Canadian tradition, we would be able to come to an agreement that would allow universal pharmacare to be a reality. And as I say, the monies that we are bringing forward are substantive, and that's why we are very optimistic that we'll be able to put in place universal pharmacare in this country.
would you force provinces to take part in the system that you're proposing, or would they be allowed to opt out?
We would be working with the provinces, and we would see where they go, but I have no doubt that it is in the interest of every province to be involved in a universal pharmacare program as we are proposing.
With respect, though, that doesn't answer the question about whether they'd be allowed to opt out.
I can't see a province saying that they would want to opt out. Of course, with the Sherbrooke Declaration.
But to be fair, two
NDP
provinces
policy,
have said they don't want to take part.
I'll finish. In terms of the Sherbrooke Declaration, we have said that Quebec could opt out with full compensation if they chose to. But in the case of other provinces, I think there will be an imperative that will be pretty clear. When you've got 1 in 5 Canadians that don't have access to Pharmacare, that they can't pay for their medication, and in many cases what that does is actually increase the loads in emergency rooms. Medication in the hospitals is paid for, medication once you leave the hospital is not. It doesn't make sense to continue to have a system where people have to go to the hospital with all of the costs that are involved when they can't access their medication. And so I think good common sense will, in the end, mean after the discussions and negotiations, the provinces will want to be on board.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr. Julian. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
BC NDP candidate Peter Julian. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.